I stared at my computer screen, pretending to focus on the quarterly reports, while Jessica and Marcus celebrated loudly at the desk cluster next to mine. They'd both been promoted to senior management positions, and they weren't letting anyone forget it. "I'm thinking of getting a new car," Jessica announced, loud enough for the entire accounting department to hear. "Maybe a BMW. Senior managers deserve to drive something with class, don't you think, Marcus?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied, adjusting his new tie, probably his third promotion tie this week. "I'm looking at condos downtown. No point in living in the suburbs when you're making real money now." I kept typing, focusing on the spreadsheet that tracked our company's financial performance. Hartwell and Associates had been struggling lately, though most employees didn't know how bad things really were. As the senior financial analyst, I had access to information that painted a grim picture of mounting debt, declining contracts, and a board of directors growing increasingly desperate. "Hey Maya," Jessica called over to me, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Still working on those boring reports? Maybe if you put yourself out there more, took some initiative, you might get noticed for a promotion too." I looked up from my screen, offering a polite smile. "Just focusing on doing my job well." "That's the problem," Marcus chimed in. "You can't just do your job well anymore. You have to think bigger, be more strategic. That's why Jessica and I are moving up while you're, well, still here." They weren't wrong about thinking strategically, just wrong about who was doing it. 3 years ago, I'd started investing in cryptocurrency when it was still considered a joke by most people. I'd been careful, strategic, never investing more than I could afford to lose. But I'd also been lucky, getting in early on several coins that had exploded in value. While my colleagues were spending their paychecks on weekend trips and designer clothes, I'd been quietly building a portfolio that had grown beyond my wildest expectations. 6 months ago, that portfolio had made me a multimillionaire. Last month, it had made me wealthy enough to buy small companies. This week, I'd been meeting with lawyers and financial advisors about a very specific acquisition opportunity. "Maya's always been more of a behind-the-scenes person," added Sarah from the next cubicle over. She'd been promoted to team lead last month, and had apparently decided that gave her permission to speak for everyone. "Some people are just meant to be support staff, you know. Not everyone can handle the pressure of real responsibility." I saved my spreadsheet and turned to face the group that had gathered around Jessica and Marcus's celebration. "You're absolutely right, Sarah. Not everyone can handle responsibility. That's why it's so important to recognize when people are in over their heads." "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus asked, his self-satisfied smile faltering slightly. "Nothing at all. I'm just agreeing with you that responsibility is important." Jessica laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Maya, you're being weird. Are you upset about not getting promoted again? Because honestly, maybe you should ask yourself why you keep getting passed over." "I think I know exactly why I keep getting passed over," I said calmly. "The same reason the company keeps making poor strategic decisions. Some people mistake loudness for leadership and confidence for competence." The celebration mood was definitely cooling now. Marcus straightened his tie again, a nervous habit I'd noticed he'd developed since his promotion. "Are you trying to say something about our qualifications?" "I'm not trying to say anything. I'm saying that the next few months are going to be very interesting around here." Before anyone could ask what I meant by that, my phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer. "Board meeting confirmed for Friday. Documents are ready." I stood up, gathering my things. "Well, this has been fun, but I have a meeting to get to." "Meeting?" Jessica asked. "With who?" "Oh, just some people about a business opportunity, nothing that would interest any of you." As I walked toward the elevator, I could hear them resuming their celebration behind me, but with less enthusiasm than before. Jessica was probably already crafting some story about how I was jealous of their success, how I was acting strange and bitter. Marcus would agree, adding his own observations about how some people just couldn't handle being left behind. They had no idea that I'd been anything but left behind. The meeting was with James Crawford, the CEO of Hartwell and Associates, and it wasn't going the way he'd expected when he'd agreed to see me. "Maya," he said, leaning back in his leather chair and trying to project an authority that his company's financial statements suggested he didn't actually possess. "I have to say, I'm surprised by your request. When my assistant said you wanted to discuss a potential investment opportunity, I assumed you were looking for advice on your 401k or something. I opened the folder I'd brought and slid a document across his mahogany desk. Actually, Mr. Crawford, I'm here to discuss purchasing Hartwell and Associates. He laughed, the kind of nervous laugh people make when they think someone is joking but aren't entirely sure. Maya, you're a good employee, but buying the company? Do you have any idea what something like that would cost? Approximately $12.3 million, based on current assets, liabilities, and market position. Though honestly, that's probably more than it's worth given the declining revenue and the 3 major clients you're about to lose next quarter. His smile faded completely. How do you know about those clients? I prepare the financial reports, remember? I know exactly what shape this company is in. I know about the loan payments you've been struggling to make, the vendors who are demanding cash up front because your credit is maxed out, and the board meeting next week where you're going to have to explain why revenue is down 30% year over year. James's face had gone pale. Maya, even if everything you're saying is accurate, and I'm not confirming that it is, do you have any idea how much money you'd need to make an offer like this? I slid another document across the desk. Here's a letter from my bank, confirming available funds. I'm prepared to offer $15 million for complete acquisition, with the stipulation that I assume all current debts and obligations. That's actually above market value, which should make your board very happy. He stared at the bank letter for a long moment, then looked back up at me as if seeing me for the first time. Maya, where did you get this kind of money? I've been investing wisely for several years. Cryptocurrency, tech stocks, some real estate. Turns out all those hours I spent researching financial markets instead of going to happy hour parties paid off. He shook his head, still trying to process what was happening. This is a serious offer? Completely serious. I have lawyers, accountants, and due diligence teams ready to move forward immediately. We could have this completed within 30 days. James set the documents down and rubbed his temples. Maya, why? Why would you want to buy a struggling company? You could invest that money anywhere. Start your own business. Retire early. Why Hartwell? I smiled, thinking about Jessica's BMW dreams and Marcus's downtown condo plans. Because I believe in the potential of this company. With proper management and strategic vision, Hartwell and Associates could be very successful. It just needs leadership that understands the difference between actual value creation and playing politics for personal advancement. 3 weeks later, I sat in the same boardroom where I'd been overlooked for promotion after promotion, but this time I was at the head of the table. The acquisition had gone through faster than anyone expected, partly because the board was so relieved to have a buyer willing to pay above market value and assume the company's debts. Jessica and Marcus sat in the middle of the conference table, their expressions ranging from confused to concerned. They'd been told that there was going to be an announcement about new ownership, but clearly neither of them had connected the dots. Good morning, everyone, I said, standing at the front of the room where James Crawford used to conduct his meetings. As you all know, Hartwell and Associates has been acquired by Maya Chen Enterprises. I'm Maya Chen, your new CEO. The silence in the room was absolute. I could see Jessica's mouth actually hanging open, while Marcus had gone completely rigid in his chair. Now, I know this comes as a surprise to many of you, I continued, but I want to assure everyone that this transition will be handled professionally and with careful consideration for all employees. However, there will be some changes in management structure as we work to align leadership with the company's new strategic direction. Sarah, the newly promoted team lead, raised her hand tentatively. Ms. Chen, what does this mean for recent promotions? That's an excellent question, Sarah. All recent personnel decisions will be reviewed as part of our organizational assessment. We'll be evaluating whether current role assignments align with actual performance, contribution to company value, and leadership potential. I could see Marcus and Jessica exchanging glances, probably realizing that their celebration might have been premature. Jessica, Marcus, I said, addressing them directly. I'd like to see both of you in my office after this meeting. We need to discuss your new roles in the company. 20 minutes later, they sat across from my desk, James Crawford's former desk, which I'd already had redecorated with actual financial reports instead of meaningless motivational posters. Maya, Jessica started, then caught herself. Miss Chen, I think there might be some misunderstanding. Marcus and I were just promoted to senior management. We have contracts. You have contracts with the previous ownership, I corrected. Those contracts are now subject to review under new management. And based on my evaluation of your actual contributions versus your compensation, I'm afraid we need to make some adjustments. Marcus leaned forward, his promotion confidence cracking. What kind of adjustments? I opened their files, which I'd been studying carefully for weeks. Marcus, your promotion to Senior Strategic Development Manager came with a 40% salary increase and a corner office. However, your actual strategic contributions over the past year have been minimal. The 3 major initiatives you claimed credit for were actually developed by team members who reported to your previous supervisor. His face flushed red. I provided oversight and guidance. You provided oversight to projects you didn't understand and guidance that was consistently overruled by people who actually knew what they were doing, I said calmly. Jessica, your promotion to Senior Client Relations Manager came with similar compensation increases, but your client satisfaction scores have actually declined during your tenure, and we've lost 2 major accounts due to what the clients described as, quote, unprofessional communication and failure to understand their needs. Jessica's BMW dreams were clearly evaporating before her eyes. Maya, we've worked together for years. You know what kind of employees we are. This seems personal. This is entirely professional, I replied. A personal response would be to fire you both immediately for creating a toxic work environment that prioritized office politics over actual performance. A professional response is to offer you both the opportunity to remain with the company in positions that actually match your demonstrated capabilities. What positions? Marcus asked, though he clearly dreaded the answer. Marcus, you're being reassigned to junior analyst, reporting to the strategic development team. Jessica, you'll be returning to your previous role in client services, with additional training in professional communication standards. Your salaries will be adjusted to match these positions. They stared at me in shock. Jessica found her voice first. You're demoting us? I'm correcting a misallocation of resources and responsibility. Your previous promotions were based on politics rather than performance. Under my leadership, advancement will be based solely on actual contribution to company success. Marcus stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. You can't just buy a company and reverse personnel decisions because you're jealous of our success. I smiled, remembering all the times he'd made similar comments about people being jealous of his advancement. Marcus, you're absolutely right. I can't reverse personnel decisions just because I'm jealous. But I can reverse them because they were objectively bad decisions that were hurting company performance. And as the owner of this company, that's exactly what I'm doing. Owner? Jessica whispered. You actually own the entire company? Every share. Which means every decision about personnel, strategy, and resource allocation flows through me. The same way it used to flow through James Crawford, except I actually understand what makes this business successful. Marcus was still standing, clearly struggling to process the situation. Maya, you were nobody. You sat in your cubicle doing reports that anyone could do. How did you suddenly become wealthy enough to buy an entire company? I stood up as well, walking around the desk to face him directly. Marcus, that's exactly the kind of thinking that made you unqualified for senior management. You assumed that because I kept quiet and focused on my work, I wasn't capable of anything more. You confused visibility with value and noise with competence. I returned to my chair, opening their new employment contracts. While you were spending your evenings networking at happy hour, I was building an investment portfolio. While you were bragging about promotions you hadn't earned, I was studying market trends and company financials. While you were assuming that your current position was permanent, I was positioning myself to control your future. Jessica was staring at the contracts with obvious dismay. Maya, please. We've been colleagues for years. We can work together professionally. We absolutely can, Jessica. In fact, I'm counting on it. You both have skills that can contribute to this company's success, just not in the roles you were previously assigned. Accept these new positions, learn to excel in them, and there will be opportunities for advancement based on actual performance. And if we refuse? Marcus asked. Then you'll be free to seek employment elsewhere, though I should mention that I'll be sharing accurate performance assessments with any potential employers who request references. The silence stretched out as they both read through their new contracts. I could see them calculating their reduced salaries, their lost corner offices, their diminished status in the company hierarchy. Finally, Jessica looked up. "Maya, I need to ask, is this revenge? Are you doing this because of how we treated you?" I considered the question carefully. "Jessica, if this were revenge, you'd both be unemployed right now. This is business. You were promoted beyond your competence, and now you're being repositioned where you can actually contribute. The fact that this situation is uncomfortable for you is a natural consequence of having built your professional identity on titles you didn't earn, rather than skills you actually possessed." Over the following months, Hartwell & Associates transformed in ways that surprised everyone, including me. With actual performance driving personnel decisions and strategic thinking replacing office politics, the company not only stabilized but began to grow. Marcus, humbled by his demotion, actually became a decent analyst once he stopped trying to manage people and focused on the work itself. Jessica struggled more with the transition, eventually leaving for a position at another company where she could maintain her preferred approach to professional advancement. But the real transformation was in company culture. Employees who had been quietly excelling despite being overlooked suddenly found themselves with opportunities for advancement. Projects that had been stalled by political considerations moved forward efficiently. Client satisfaction improved dramatically, as decisions were made based on business value rather than personal relationships. Sarah, the team lead who had dismissed me as support staff, adapted quickly to the new environment and actually proved to have genuine leadership potential once she stopped focusing on climbing the hierarchy and started focusing on delivering results. 6 months after the acquisition, I stood in my office, the same space where James Crawford used to hold meetings about declining revenue, reviewing quarterly reports that showed consistent growth across all major metrics. "Ms. Chen," my new assistant knocked on the open door. "The board meeting is ready to begin." I gathered my materials, including the financial projections that showed Hartwell & Associates on track to double its revenue within 2 years. As I walked to the boardroom, I passed the cubicle where I used to sit, now occupied by a talented young analyst who reminded me of myself a few years ago, quiet, focused, and probably capable of much more than anyone realized. The board meeting was brief and positive. Revenue was up, client retention was at an all-time high, and employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvement across all departments. The board members, who had been prepared for months of difficult discussions about company survival, were instead talking about expansion opportunities and market growth. After the meeting, I returned to my office and opened my laptop to check on my investment portfolio. The cryptocurrency and tech stocks that had funded the acquisition were continuing to perform well, and I was already identifying opportunities for additional acquisitions. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Maya, it's Marcus. I wanted to thank you for keeping me on. I know I didn't handle the transition well, but working in my current role has taught me a lot about what I actually need to do to advance. Would it be possible to schedule a meeting to discuss development opportunities?" I smiled, remembering the Marcus who had bragged about his unearned promotion and dismissed my potential. This Marcus was asking for development opportunities based on actual skill building rather than demanding advancement based on assumed entitlement. I typed back, "Of course. Set up a meeting with my assistant for next week. Bring a proposal for a specific project you'd like to lead and how you plan to measure its success." As I finished responding to Marcus's text, I thought about Jessica's question from months ago about whether my actions were motivated by revenge. The honest answer was more complicated than I'd admitted at the time. Had I enjoyed the look on their faces when they realized their former colleague now owned the company? Absolutely. Did I take satisfaction in correcting the organizational dysfunction that had allowed incompetent people to advance while talented people were overlooked? Without question. But the deeper motivation had been the recognition that I could do better, not just for myself but for everyone who worked at Hartwell & Associates. The company had potential that was being wasted by poor leadership and misaligned incentives. Buying the company hadn't been about punishing Jessica and Marcus for their arrogance. It had been about creating an environment where actual talent could flourish. The fact that their downfall was a necessary part of that transformation was just a bonus. That evening, I drove home in my reliable Honda. I'd decided against upgrading to something flashier, preferring to invest additional capital in growing the business rather than displaying wealth I'd already proven I possessed. As I passed a BMW dealership, I wondered if Jessica had ever bought that car she'd talked about, or if the reality of her reduced circumstances had forced her to reconsider her priorities. At home, I opened my laptop and began researching another potential acquisition, a small consulting firm that was struggling with the same kinds of management problems that had plagued Hartwell. The owner was brilliant but overwhelmed, and several of his best employees were being overlooked, while less competent colleagues received promotions based on personal relationships rather than performance. I smiled as I began drafting an initial offer. Some people collected art or expensive cars. I was apparently collecting underperforming companies with excellent potential and transforming them into organizations where talent was actually rewarded. It was turning out to be a very profitable hobby, and I was just getting started. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the version of myself who had sat in that cubicle just a year ago, quietly building wealth while colleagues who assumed I was going nowhere bragged about promotions they hadn't earned. They'd been right about one thing: not everyone could handle the pressure of real responsibility. But they'd been completely wrong about who was actually capable of carrying that responsibility effectively. And now, as the owner of a thriving company with plans for continued expansion, I was in a position to ensure that capability, not politics, would determine who advanced and who remained stuck in positions that reflected their actual value contribution. It was exactly the kind of responsibility I'd been preparing for all along. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the version of myself who had sat in that cubicle just a year ago, quietly building wealth while colleagues who assumed I was going nowhere bragged about promotions they hadn't earned. They'd been right about one thing: not everyone could handle the pressure of real responsibility. But they'd been completely wrong about who was actually capable of carrying that responsibility effectively. And now, as the owner of a thriving company with plans for continued expansion, I was in a position to ensure that capability, not politics, would determine who advanced and who remained stuck in positions that reflected their actual value contribution. It was exactly the kind of responsibility I'd been preparing for all along. 2 years later, Maya Chen Enterprises had grown into a portfolio of 7 companies, each one a former underperformer that I'd acquired and transformed using the same principles I'd applied to Hartwell and Associates. My approach had become a recognizable pattern in the business community: identify organizations where politics had replaced performance, acquire them at fair market value, then systematically realign leadership with actual capability. The business press had started calling it the Chen method, though I preferred to think of it simply as common sense applied consistently. I was reviewing acquisition prospects in my corner office, a space I'd expanded by combining 3 smaller offices after purchasing the entire floor of the downtown building where Hartwell was located, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Chen, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. Her name is Jessica Torres." I looked up from the financial statements I'd been analyzing. Jessica had left Hartwell 18 months ago, and I hadn't heard from her since. "Send her in." Jessica entered my office looking notably different from the confident woman who had once bragged about buying a BMW. Her clothes were professional but clearly not expensive, and she carried herself with a humility that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew her during her brief period as Senior Client Relations Manager. "Maya," she said, then caught herself. "Ms. Chen, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. Please, sit down. And Jessica, we worked together for 3 years. You can call me Maya." She settled into the chair across from my desk, looking around the office that had clearly grown far beyond what she remembered. "I heard about your expansion. 7 companies now?" 8 as of last week. "But I assume you didn't come here to discuss my business portfolio." Jessica took a deep breath. "Actually, I did, in a way. Maya, I need to apologize. Not just for how I treated you at Hartwell, but for not understanding what was really happening while I was there." I leaned back in my chair, curious where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I spent 2 years at Brennan & Associates, the company I went to after leaving Hartwell, and I finally understand the difference between being promoted because someone likes you and being promoted because you've earned it." "How so?" "Brennan operates the same way Hartwell used to operate. Office politics, favoritism, advancement based on relationships rather than results. I thought I'd be successful there because I understood that system. She paused, looking uncomfortable. I was wrong. What happened? I was there for 6 months before I realized that everyone was playing the same game I'd been playing at Hartwell, but they were better at it than I was. The people who got promoted weren't necessarily more competent than me, but they were more skilled at managing up, at taking credit for other people's work, at positioning themselves for advancement. Jessica shifted in her chair, clearly struggling with what she was about to say. Maya, I spent 18 months watching actually talented people get frustrated and leave, while incompetent people advanced through pure politics. I finally understood what you meant when you talked about the difference between loudness and leadership. And now? Now I'm working as a client services coordinator at a small firm downtown. It's basically the same role I had before my promotion at Hartwell, but the company is run by people who actually care about performance over politics. I'm learning what it means to actually be good at my job instead of just good at seeming important. I studied Jessica's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but I saw only genuine regret and hard-won wisdom. Jessica, what do you want from this conversation? 2 things. First, I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you and for not recognizing what you were building while I was busy playing games. Second, I wanted to ask if you might have any openings at any of your companies for someone who's finally learned the difference between actual value and perceived status. I was quiet for a moment, considering her request. The Jessica sitting in my office was clearly not the same person who had dismissed me as support staff and bragged about promotions she hadn't earned. But people could change their behavior without changing their fundamental character. Jessica, let me ask you something. At Brennan & Associates, when you saw the same political dynamics that existed at Hartwell, what did you do about it? At first, I tried to play the game better. I figured if I could just out-network and out-politic the other people, I'd be successful. And when that didn't work, I got frustrated and started complaining to other employees about how unfair the system was. I thought if enough people agreed with me, something would change. She shook her head. That just made me look like a troublemaker who couldn't adapt. So what changed your perspective? There was a woman in my department, Sandra Kim, who was consistently excellent at her job. She never played politics, never brown-nosed the managers, just delivered exceptional work every single day. I watched her get passed over for promotion after promotion, while less qualified people advanced around her. Jessica's voice grew quieter. One day I made some comment about how Sandra should speak up more, should make herself more visible if she wanted to get ahead. And Sandra looked at me and said, Jessica, I'm not trying to get ahead of anyone, I'm trying to get excellent at what I do. If this company doesn't value excellence, that's information I can use to make decisions about my career. What did she do? She left for a company that recognized her abilities and promoted her to senior management within 6 months. Meanwhile, I was still at Brennan trying to figure out why playing the political game wasn't making me happy even when I won. I nodded, beginning to understand the change I was seeing in Jessica. And that's when you realized the game itself was the problem? Exactly. I realized that I'd spent years focusing on advancing instead of improving, on seeming important instead of being valuable. When Sandra left and I saw how quickly she succeeded in an environment that valued actual contribution, I understood what I'd been doing wrong. So why come to me? Why not find another company like the one Sandra joined? Jessica smiled ruefully. Because after researching your acquisitions and reading about the Chen method, I realized that you're not just running companies that value performance over politics. You're actively transforming businesses to eliminate the kind of toxic culture that I spent years perpetuating. She leaned forward slightly. Maya, I want to work for someone who's committed to the same principles I'm finally learning to embrace. I want to contribute to something meaningful instead of just advancing my own career. I considered her request carefully. Jessica's transformation seemed genuine, but hiring former adversaries carried risks beyond just personal comfort. Jessica, let me be direct. Even if I believed your change of perspective is authentic, why would I hire you over candidates who didn't need to learn these lessons the hard way? People who already understand the difference between contribution and self-promotion? Because, she said, meeting my eyes directly, I understand intimately how toxic workplace politics operate and why they're so seductive to people who haven't learned better. I can help identify and address those dynamics before they take root. It was a compelling argument, but I needed more than just her word. Here's what I'm willing to do, I said. I'm currently evaluating the acquisition of a mid-size marketing firm called Creative Solutions, Inc. They're struggling with exactly the kind of management problems I typically target for transformation. If you're serious about applying what you've learned, you can help me with the due diligence process. What would that involve? You'd spend 2 weeks doing undercover evaluation of their workplace culture, not as a potential employee, but as a consultant analyzing their organizational dynamics. I want a detailed report on how politics and performance interact in their current system, who the real contributors are versus who gets credited for success, and what changes would be needed to align advancement with actual value creation. Jessica's eyes lit up with something I'd never seen during our time working together. Genuine enthusiasm for a challenging project rather than just excitement about personal advancement. Maya, that sounds incredible, but why would you trust me with that kind of responsibility? Because the best way to test whether someone has really learned from their mistakes is to give them an opportunity to apply that knowledge in a way that matters. If you've genuinely changed, this project will demonstrate it. If you haven't, that will become apparent quickly too. 2 weeks later, Jessica delivered a report that exceeded my expectations in every way. Her analysis of Creative Solutions, Inc. was thorough, insightful, and demonstrated the kind of systemic thinking I'd been hoping to see from her. Their biggest problem isn't individual incompetence, she explained during our debriefing meeting. It's that they've created incentive structures that reward the wrong behaviors. People who collaborate and share credit get overlooked, while people who hoard information and take credit for collective efforts get promoted. Give me an example. Their most successful client campaign last quarter was developed primarily by a junior designer named Alex Chen and a mid-level strategist named Maria Santos. But the credit went to David Park, the creative director who presented it to the client, and Jennifer Walsh, the account manager who had the client relationship. And Alex and Maria? Alex is looking for other jobs because he's tired of seeing his work attributed to other people. Maria has stopped contributing innovative ideas in meetings because she knows someone else will get credit for implementing them. I nodded, recognizing patterns I'd seen in every dysfunctional organization I'd acquired. What's your recommendation for addressing this? Complete transparency in project attribution, combined with advancement criteria that explicitly reward collaboration and contribution rather than visibility and self-promotion. But more importantly, you'd need to replace the current leadership team with people who model the behaviors you want to see. Including David and Jennifer? Jessica hesitated for only a moment. David might be salvageable if he's willing to change his approach, but Jennifer has built her entire career on taking credit for other people's work. She'd need to be replaced. It was exactly the kind of difficult but necessary assessment I'd been hoping Jessica could provide. Jessica, based on this report and your analysis, I'm prepared to offer you a position as Organizational Development Manager for Maya Chen Enterprises. You'd work directly with me on evaluating acquisitions and implementing cultural transformations across our portfolio companies. The look of shock and gratitude on her face was almost embarrassing in its intensity. Maya, I thank you. This is more than I hoped for. Don't thank me yet. This role requires someone who can be brutally honest about organizational dysfunction, even when that honesty affects people they like personally. It means making recommendations that will end careers for people who've built their success on political maneuvering rather than actual contribution. I understand. And Maya? I know I don't deserve this opportunity based on how I behaved at Hartwell, but I promise you won't regret giving it to me. 6 months into Jessica's new role, the Creative Solutions, Inc. acquisition had become our most successful transformation yet. Her insights into dysfunctional workplace politics proved invaluable in identifying not just who needed to be replaced, but how to restructure incentive systems to prevent similar problems from developing in the future. Alex Chen, the overlooked junior designer, was now creative director, leading a team that had increased client satisfaction scores by 40%. Maria Santos had been promoted to senior strategy director and was developing innovative campaigns that were winning industry awards. David Park had initially resisted the cultural changes but eventually adapted, and was now mentoring junior staff in collaborative leadership techniques. Jennifer Walsh, as Jessica had predicted, was unwilling to adjust her approach and had been let go during the first month of the transition. But Jessica's transformation went beyond just professional effectiveness. Working to identify and eliminate the kind of toxic dynamics she'd once participated in seemed to have given her a sense of purpose that had been missing during her years of pursuing advancement for its own sake. "Maya," she said during one of our weekly check-ins, "I wanted to ask you about something. Marcus reached out to me last week." I looked up from the acquisition reports I'd been reviewing. Marcus had thrived in his analyst role at Hartwell and had recently been promoted to senior analyst based on consistently excellent performance. What did he want? He said he's been thinking about our old dynamic at Hartwell and wanted to apologize for how we treated you. But more than that, he wanted to understand how you saw through our behavior when we couldn't see it ourselves. What did you tell him? That you were paying attention to results while we were paying attention to appearances. That you understood the difference between contributing to something larger than yourself versus just trying to advance your own position. I smiled, remembering the Marcus who had bragged about promotions he hadn't earned and dismissed my potential based on my quiet demeanor. How did he respond? He asked if there might be opportunities at any of your companies for someone who's learned to focus on contribution over self-promotion. He said working under the new system at Hartwell has taught him more about actual leadership in 2 years than his previous promotion taught him in 6 months. It was an interesting request. Marcus had genuinely transformed his approach at Hartwell, moving from someone who took credit for other people's work to someone who actively helped his teammates succeed. But hiring both Jessica and Marcus would mean surrounding myself with people who had once dismissed and undermined me. "What's your assessment?" I asked Jessica. "You know Marcus better than I do, and you understand both his old patterns and his current behavior." Jessica considered the question carefully. The Marcus I knew at Hartwell was insecure and compensated by trying to appear more important than he actually was. The Marcus I talked to last week seemed genuinely interested in learning how to be actually valuable, rather than just seeming valuable. But I also know how easy it is to say you've changed, and how hard it is to actually maintain that change when you're under pressure or when old patterns would be more convenient. I appreciated her honesty. Jessica had learned to be skeptical of claims of transformation because she understood from experience how difficult real change actually was. "Here's what I'm thinking," I said. "We're about to begin due diligence on Meridian Consulting, and their organizational problems are more complex than anything we've tackled before. If Marcus is serious about applying what he's learned, he can work with you on that evaluation." "A team assessment?" "Exactly. You can evaluate how well he's internalized the lessons about contribution versus self-promotion. And he can demonstrate whether his transformation is genuine or just strategic positioning for advancement." Jessica smiled. "Maya, that's brilliant. If he's really changed, working together on a meaningful project will bring out his best qualities. If he's still playing games, the pressure of the evaluation process will reveal that quickly. And Jessica, if either of you reverts to old patterns during this project, you'll both be looking for new jobs. I won't tolerate toxic workplace dynamics in any form, regardless of personal history or claimed transformation." "Understood. And honestly, Maya, I appreciate the clear expectations. It's much easier to succeed when you know exactly what excellence looks like." The Meridian Consulting evaluation proved to be the most challenging project we'd undertaken. The company's problems went beyond simple management dysfunction into complex webs of interdepartmental conflict, misaligned incentives, and deeply embedded cultural issues that had been festering for years. But Jessica and Marcus's collaboration exceeded every expectation I had. Jessica's insights into political manipulation combined with Marcus's analytical skills to produce an assessment that identified not just surface problems, but the underlying systemic issues that had created those problems. The fundamental issue, Marcus explained during their final presentation, is that Meridian has created separate advancement tracks for different departments, but they haven't aligned those tracks with overall company objectives. People are succeeding in their individual departments while contributing to collective failure. "For example," I asked. Jessica pulled up a detailed organizational chart. The sales department is incentivized to close deals regardless of whether those deals are profitable or sustainable. The operations department is incentivized to reduce costs, regardless of whether those cuts affect service quality. The client services department is incentivized to maintain relationships, regardless of whether clients are actually receiving value. So everyone is individually succeeding while the company collectively fails? Exactly, Marcus confirmed. And because each department measures success differently, there's no shared understanding of what company-wide success even looks like. What's your recommendation? Jessica and Marcus exchanged a look before Jessica responded. Complete restructuring around cross-functional teams focused on specific client outcomes rather than departmental metrics. It would require replacing most of the current management structure with people who understand how to balance individual excellence with collective success. How many of the current managers would survive that kind of restructuring? Marcus consulted his notes. Maybe 30%. The rest are either too invested in the current system to adapt, or they've built their success on taking advantage of the misaligned incentives. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive assessment I needed to make an informed acquisition decision, but more importantly, it demonstrated that both Jessica and Marcus had genuinely evolved beyond their former patterns of behavior. Jessica, Marcus, this is exceptional work. You've identified problems that weren't visible in the financial statements and developed solutions that address root causes rather than just symptoms. Marcus smiled, but it was the kind of satisfied smile that comes from completing difficult work well rather than the self-promotional smile I remembered from his days of seeking unearned advancement. Maya, he said, working on this project has taught me more about strategic thinking than any promotion I ever received. When you're focused on actually solving problems instead of just appearing to solve them, the work becomes completely different. Different how? More challenging, but also more satisfying. When I was focused on getting promoted, success felt temporary because it was based on perception rather than reality. But when you're focused on contributing to something that actually works, success feels like building something lasting. Jessica nodded in agreement. Maya, I have to ask, when you bought Hartwell, did you already know you'd eventually want to hire us? Was our transformation part of some larger plan? I considered the question carefully. Honestly, when I bought Hartwell, I expected both of you to either quit in anger or struggle to adapt and eventually be let go. Your transformation wasn't part of any plan. It was a surprise that became an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? The opportunity to prove that the Chen method isn't just about replacing bad managers with good ones. It's about creating environments where people can genuinely change and grow. You've both demonstrated that even people who've developed toxic professional habits can learn better approaches when they're given clear expectations and meaningful work. Marcus looked thoughtful. Maya, can I ask you something personal? When we were all at Hartwell, when Jessica and I were bragging about our promotions and dismissing your potential, did you already know you were going to buy the company? I knew I was building wealth and looking for investment opportunities. I didn't specifically plan to acquire Hartwell until I realized how badly it was being managed and how much potential was being wasted. But you must have known we were wrong about you, about your capabilities. I smiled, remembering those days of quiet confidence while colleagues underestimated my ambitions. Marcus, I knew exactly what I was capable of. The question was whether I'd get the opportunity to demonstrate it within the existing system, or whether I'd need to create my own opportunities. And when you realized you'd need to create your own opportunities, that's when I started researching acquisition targets. Hartwell was attractive not because I wanted revenge against people who had underestimated me, but because it was a fundamentally sound business being held back by poor leadership and dysfunctional culture. Jessica leaned forward. Maya, looking back, do you think there was any way we could have recognized your potential without the shock of you buying the company? I thought about it honestly. Jessica, you and Marcus were so focused on the appearance of success that you weren't paying attention to actual indicators of competence. I was quietly outperforming most of our department while you were networking your way to promotions you hadn't earned. So we could have seen it if we'd been looking for the right things. You could have seen it if you'd been more interested in substance than surface. But that would have required you to value things you didn't value at the time. Marcus nodded slowly. That's what I mean about the work being different now. When you're actually trying to understand how things work, instead of just trying to appear important, you notice completely different things. Exactly. And that's why your assessment of Meridian was so thorough. You were looking for real problems and real solutions instead of just trying to impress me with how smart you sound. Over the following year, the Meridian acquisition became another success story, with Jessica and Marcus leading the cultural transformation that turned a dysfunctional organization into a model of cross-functional collaboration. But more satisfying than the business success was watching two people, who had once embodied everything wrong with corporate culture, evolve into leaders who actively worked to prevent those same problems in other organizations. The business press continued to write articles about the Chen method, often focusing on the financial returns of acquiring underperforming companies and improving their operations. But they missed the deeper story about human transformation and the possibility of creating work environments where people could genuinely grow beyond their worst professional habits. I was reviewing quarterly reports from all 8 companies in the Maya Chen Enterprises portfolio when my assistant knocked on my door. "Ms. Chen, there's someone here to see you. He says he used to work for you and that it's important. His name is James Crawford." I looked up, surprised. James Crawford, the former CEO of Hartwell & Associates, had moved to Florida after I acquired the company and had largely disappeared from the business community. "Send him in." James entered my office looking older and more tired than I remembered, but also somehow more at peace. He'd lost the artificial confidence that had masked his insecurity during his final months at Hartwell and replaced it with something that seemed more genuinely grounded. "Maya," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I don't have any right to your time." "James, we worked together for 3 years. You always have time if you need it. What brings you back to New York?" I wanted to apologize, and to thank you. I raised an eyebrow. For what? For saving my company and my employees from my poor leadership, and for doing it in a way that preserved jobs and actually improved working conditions, instead of just maximizing short-term profits. James looked around my expanded office, taking in the evidence of how much Maya Chen Enterprises had grown since acquiring his struggling firm. "Maya, I've spent the last 2 years thinking about what went wrong during my time as CEO, and I've realized that I never understood the difference between being in charge and being a leader." "How so?" "I thought leadership meant making decisions and having other people implement them. I thought success meant maintaining authority and getting people to do what I wanted them to do." He shook his head. "I completely missed the point." "Which was?" "Leadership means creating environments where other people can do their best work. Success means building something that's genuinely valuable rather than just protecting your own position." I studied James's face, looking for signs of the desperate manipulation I'd seen during our final months of working together, but I found only genuine reflection and hard-won wisdom. "James, what have you been doing in Florida?" "Teaching," he said, surprising me completely, "business management at a community college. When I moved down there, I was bitter and angry about losing the company. But after a few months, I realized that my anger was really just embarrassment about having failed at something I thought I was good at." "So you decided to teach?" "I decided to figure out what I actually understood about business management versus what I'd just been pretending to understand. Teaching forced me to really examine the fundamentals instead of just relying on authority and hoping for the best." "And what did you discover?" James smiled ruefully. "That I'd spent years managing people instead of leading them, focusing on control instead of empowerment, and measuring success in terms of compliance rather than contribution. Those are significant realizations. Maya, my students are mostly working adults who are trying to move into management roles at their current companies. Many of them are in situations similar to what you experienced at Hartwell, talented people being overlooked by managers who don't recognize actual potential." "So you're teaching them to recognize their own capabilities?" "I'm teaching them to focus on developing real competence rather than just playing political games. But more than that, I'm teaching them to look for opportunities to contribute value even when they're not getting credit or recognition for it." I was beginning to understand why James had come to see me. "You're teaching them to be more like I was at Hartwell." "I'm teaching them to build their capabilities quietly and systematically, the same way you did. But Maya, I also want them to understand that sometimes the system won't reward excellence, and when that happens, they need to be prepared to create their own opportunities." "Like I did by acquiring Hartwell?" "Exactly." Most of my students don't have the resources to buy companies, but they can develop the skills and perspective needed to recognize when they're in dysfunctional organizations and make strategic decisions about their careers. It was an interesting approach, and I found myself curious about how his students were responding. James, how has teaching changed your perspective on what happened at Hartwell? It's made me realize that you tried to tell me what was wrong with our organizational culture multiple times, but I wasn't listening because I didn't want to acknowledge that our problems were fundamentally management problems. When did I try to tell you? Remember the quarterly review meeting where you presented data showing that our most profitable clients were the ones being managed by our least promoted employees? And you suggested that maybe we should examine whether our promotion criteria were aligned with actual performance indicators. I did remember that meeting. James had dismissed my analysis as interesting data and moved on to other topics without addressing the implications. I told you that the data was interesting, but that promotion decisions were based on multiple factors beyond just client profitability, he continued. What I really meant was that I didn't want to examine whether our promotion decisions had been mistakes. Because that would have meant acknowledging that the people you'd promoted weren't actually the best performers? Exactly. And acknowledging that would have meant admitting that I didn't really understand what made people successful in their roles. James leaned forward slightly. Maya, you were trying to help me run the company better, but I interpreted your suggestions as criticism of my leadership. I was so focused on defending my authority that I missed opportunities to actually improve our operations. It was a level of self-reflection I hadn't expected from James, and it suggested a genuine transformation rather than just strategic positioning. James, why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to know that your approach to business, focusing on actual value creation rather than just maintaining authority, has influenced how I teach my students about leadership and management. In what way? I use Maya Chen Enterprises as a case study. I teach them about how you identified organizational dysfunction, developed systematic approaches to address it, and created environments where people could actually succeed based on contribution rather than politics. I was surprised and somewhat moved by this revelation. You teach about my acquisition strategy? I teach about your transformation strategy. The acquisitions are just the delivery mechanism for what's really important, creating workplace cultures where excellence is rewarded and where people can grow beyond their current limitations. James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Maya, I've been developing a curriculum based on analyzing your approach to organizational change. I was hoping you might be willing to review it and provide feedback. I opened the folder and found a comprehensive analysis of the Chen method, complete with case studies from Hartwell, Creative Solutions, and Meridian Consulting. The analysis was thorough, insightful, and demonstrated a level of understanding about my approach that I hadn't realized was possible from an outside observer. James, this is remarkable work. You've identified patterns in my method that I hadn't consciously recognized myself. Such as your observation that I consistently target companies where the gap between actual performance and perceived performance is largest. I knew I was looking for undervalued organizations, but I hadn't realized that the undervaluation was specifically about human capital rather than just financial metrics. James smiled. Maya, when you acquired Hartwell, you weren't just buying a struggling business. You were buying a collection of people whose potential was being wasted by poor management. The financial turnaround was a natural result of better utilizing human resources. That's exactly right, but I'd never articulated it that way. Because you were focused on implementation rather than theory. But for teaching purposes, the theoretical framework helps students understand why your approach works and how they might adapt it to their own situations. I continued reading through James's analysis, impressed by both its accuracy and its practical applications. James, have you considered turning this into a book? There's clearly a market for management approaches that actually work, and your perspective as someone who experienced both ineffective and effective leadership styles would be valuable. I've thought about it, but honestly, I'm not sure I have the credibility to write about effective business leadership given my track record at Hartwell. James, that's exactly why you do have credibility. You understand both what doesn't work and what does work because you've experienced both sides. Most business books are written by people who've only experienced success. and therefore can't adequately explain why other approaches fail. You think my failure at Hartwell actually makes me more qualified to write about effective leadership? I think your honest analysis of that failure, combined with your understanding of what I did differently, makes you uniquely positioned to help other managers avoid similar mistakes. James looked thoughtful. Maya, would you be willing to contribute to a book project like that? Not as a co-author, but as someone who could verify the accuracy of my analysis and provide additional insights into your decision-making process? It was an intriguing proposal. A book about organizational transformation, written by someone who had experienced both sides of the process, could indeed be valuable for managers struggling with similar challenges. James, let me think about it, but I'm definitely interested in the concept. Thank you. And Maya, regardless of whether you decide to participate in a book project, I want you to know that watching you transform Hartwell taught me more about effective leadership than my entire previous career. After James left, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought us to this point. 3 years ago, he had been a failing CEO, desperately trying to maintain authority in a dysfunctional organization. Now he was teaching others how to recognize and correct the same problems he had once embodied. Jessica had evolved from someone who pursued advancement through politics to someone who helped organizations eliminate political dysfunction. Marcus had transformed from someone who took credit for other people's work to someone who actively helped teammates succeed. And James had moved from ineffective leadership to teaching others about effective leadership. The common thread in all these transformations was the recognition that sustainable success came from contributing genuine value, rather than just managing perceptions or protecting individual positions. But the most surprising aspect of these changes was how much they had influenced my own understanding of what I was building with Maya Chen Enterprises. I had started with the goal of acquiring underperforming companies and improving their financial returns. But I had inadvertently created a laboratory for human transformation, demonstrating that people could genuinely change their professional approach when given clear expectations and meaningful work. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the latest quarterly reports from all 9 companies in the Maya Chen Enterprises portfolio. Every organization was performing well financially, but more importantly, employee satisfaction surveys showed consistent improvement across all metrics related to fairness, opportunity for advancement, and alignment between contribution and recognition. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to James Crawford, accepting his invitation to collaborate on a book about organizational transformation. But as I wrote, I realized that the real story wasn't just about business methods or management techniques. The real story was about the possibility of creating work environments where people could evolve beyond their worst professional habits and discover capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. It was about proving that sustainable business success came from empowering people rather than controlling them, from recognizing actual contribution rather than just rewarding political skill. Most importantly, it was about demonstrating that even people who had been written off as incapable of change could transform themselves when given the right combination of clear expectations, meaningful challenges, and genuine opportunities to contribute to something larger than their own advancement. As I finished the email and sent it to James, I reflected on how different my life had become from those days when I sat quietly in my cubicle, building wealth while colleagues assumed I was going nowhere. The financial success had been satisfying, but the human transformations had been genuinely meaningful. Tomorrow, I would begin due diligence on my 10th potential acquisition, a technology consulting firm whose talented employees were leaving faster than they could be replaced because advancement was based on politics rather than performance. It was exactly the kind of challenge I had learned to recognize and address. But tonight, I was content to sit in my home office, surrounded by evidence of what was possible when people focused on contribution rather than self-promotion, and to plan how I might help even more organizations discover the difference between managing people and actually leading them. The Maya Chen Enterprises portfolio was growing, but more importantly, it was proving every day that business success and human development weren't competing priorities. They were complementary aspects of building something that would outlast any individual career and create lasting value for everyone involved. It had been quite a journey from that cubicle where Jessica and Marcus once dismissed my potential, and I was just getting started. It had been quite a journey from that cubicle where Jessica and Marcus once dismissed my potential, And I was just getting started. 6 months later, the book James and I co-authored, Beyond Politics, Building Organizations Where Talent Actually Wins, had become an unexpected bestseller in business management circles. But more importantly, it had attracted attention from sources I hadn't anticipated. I was in my office reviewing the morning's emails when my assistant buzzed in. "Ms. Chen, there's a call for you from the office of Senator Elizabeth Warren. They say it's regarding your business practices and potential policy implications." I picked up the phone, curious about what a U.S. senator might want with my relatively small portfolio of companies. "Ms. Chen," came a warm but professional voice, "this is Sarah Martinez from Senator Warren's office. The senator has been following your work with great interest, particularly your approach to addressing income inequality and workplace dysfunction through strategic acquisitions. I'm flattered by the attention, but I'm not sure I understand the policy connection. Ms. Chen, your companies have achieved something that most policy interventions have failed to accomplish. You've demonstrated that businesses can be both highly profitable and genuinely equitable in terms of advancement opportunities and compensation alignment." I leaned back in my chair, intrigued by where this conversation might be heading. "The senator is chairing a subcommittee on economic inequality and workplace reform," Sarah continued. "She'd like to invite you to testify about your methods and discuss whether elements of your approach could be scaled or incentivized through policy changes." "Testify before Congress?" "Before a Senate subcommittee, yes. Your work represents a market-based solution to problems that many people assume require government intervention. The senator thinks your perspective could be valuable in developing policies that encourage more businesses to adopt similar approaches." After the call, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the implications. Maya Chen Enterprises had grown beyond my original expectations, but I'd always thought of it as a business strategy rather than a social movement. The idea that my approach might have policy implications was both exciting and slightly overwhelming. My reflection was interrupted by Jessica knocking on my open door. "Maya, do you have a minute? I wanted to discuss something unusual that came up during our assessment of TechFlow Industries." TechFlow was our latest acquisition target, a software development company that had all the familiar signs of political dysfunction and misaligned incentives. Jessica and Marcus had been conducting their now standard organizational assessment, but apparently they'd discovered something unexpected. "What kind of unusual?" I asked as Jessica settled into her chair. "We found a whistleblower situation. One of their senior developers, Amy Rodriguez, has documented extensive evidence of gender and racial discrimination in their promotion processes. But Maya, the discrimination isn't coming from managers who are overtly biased. It's coming from the same political game playing we've seen elsewhere, except the politics are amplifying existing social inequalities." I frowned, realizing that this was a more complex challenge than our previous acquisitions. "Explain what you mean." TechFlow's advancement system rewards people who are skilled at self-promotion and networking within the company. But the networking happens primarily through after-work social events and informal mentorship relationships that tend to exclude women and people of color. So the system appears neutral but produces discriminatory outcomes? Exactly. Amy and several other talented developers are being overlooked, not because of overt prejudice, but because they don't have access to the informal networks where real advancement decisions get made. Jessica pulled out her tablet and showed me detailed documentation of promotion patterns over the past 5 years. "Look at this data. Every single person promoted to senior technical leadership has been someone who regularly attended the weekly happy hours, played on the company's softball team, or had golf relationships with existing managers." I studied the patterns, recognizing something more troubling than the simple political dysfunction we'd addressed in other companies. So our standard approach of merit-based advancement criteria might not be sufficient if the underlying social dynamics are creating barriers to participation. That's what I'm worried about. Maya, we can implement transparent performance metrics and eliminate obvious political favoritism, but if we don't address the social dynamics that determine who gets heard and who gets mentored, we might just create a more sophisticated form of the same exclusion. It was a sobering insight. Jessica's transformation had given her the ability to recognize political manipulation, But now she was applying that awareness to identify more subtle forms of systemic bias. What does Amy recommend? She's proposed a complete restructuring of how informal mentorship and networking happen within the company. Instead of hoping that talented people will somehow gain access to existing networks, she wants to create formal structures that ensure everyone has equal access to advancement opportunities. Such as structured mentorship programs that cross demographic lines, project assignment processes that rotate high-visibility work among different teams, and social events that are inclusive rather than exclusive. Jessica paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. Maya, there's something else. Amy asked specifically whether you'd be willing to meet with her before we finalize the acquisition. She said she's heard about your approach and wants to understand whether you're genuinely committed to addressing systemic problems or just surface-level dysfunction. I was impressed by Amy's directness. Most employees of acquisition targets tried to position themselves favorably with new ownership, rather than challenging them to prove their commitments. Set up the meeting. I want to hear her perspective directly. Amy Rodriguez turned out to be exactly the kind of person I'd been hoping to find in our acquisition targets. Brilliant, principled, and frustrated by seeing her potential wasted by organizational dysfunction. But her insights into TechFlow's problems went deeper than anything Jessica and Marcus had identified. Ms. Chen, she said during our meeting, I've been researching your other acquisitions, and I'm impressed by how you've improved advancement opportunities for people who are being overlooked. But I need to know whether you understand that some of that overlooking is specifically about gender and race, not just general political incompetence. Explain what you mean. At Hartwell Creative Solutions and your other companies, most of the people who benefited from your changes were white men who had been overlooked because they weren't good at office politics. That's valuable progress, but it's not the same as addressing barriers that specifically affect women and people of color. Amy pulled out a laptop and showed me detailed analysis she'd done of promotion patterns across my portfolio companies. Your transformations have improved outcomes for everyone, but the improvements have been proportionally larger for people who already had some advantages in the system. I studied her data, realizing she was right. While all my companies had become more merit-based, the people who had most benefited from those changes were primarily people like Marcus, talented but politically unskilled white men who had been overshadowed by more manipulative colleagues. Amy, what would addressing these deeper issues look like? It would mean recognizing that merit-based advancement isn't enough if your definition of merit is based on criteria that inadvertently favor certain groups. For example, if you reward people for being assertive in meetings, you might be disadvantaging people from cultures where speaking over others is considered rude. So we need to examine our advancement criteria for hidden biases? Exactly. But more than that, you need to actively create opportunities for people who might not naturally put themselves forward. In tech, there are brilliant developers who will never volunteer to lead a high-profile project because they've been conditioned to believe that kind of visibility isn't for them. Amy leaned forward, her passion for the subject evident. Ms. Chen, your approach of eliminating political advancement is revolutionary. But if you could combine that with actively addressing systemic barriers, you could create something that's never existed in corporate America, truly equitable advancement based on actual contribution. It was an ambitious vision, and I found myself excited by the challenge it represented. Amy, if I acquired TechFlow and asked you to lead the organizational transformation, focusing specifically on these equity issues, would you be interested? Her eyes lit up with the same enthusiasm I'd seen in Jessica when offered the chance to help eliminate toxic workplace dynamics. Ms. Chen, that would be exactly the kind of work I've been hoping to do. But I'd want assurance that you're committed to addressing these issues, even when they're more complex than just eliminating obvious favoritism. What kind of complexity? For example, what if we discovered that some of your existing managers at other companies, people who've been successful under your merit-based systems, still have unconscious biases that affect their evaluation of women or people of color? Are you willing to address those problems even if it means more extensive changes than you've previously made? It was a fair question, and one that pushed beyond my comfort zone. I'd been focused on eliminating obvious political dysfunction, but Amy was asking whether I was prepared to examine more subtle forms of systemic bias. Amy, I can't promise that I'll handle every situation perfectly, but I can promise that I'm committed to learning and adapting our approach based on evidence about what actually works. If our current methods have blind spots, I want to identify and address them. That's all I can ask for. The TechFlow acquisition became our most complex transformation yet, but also our most successful in terms of creating genuinely equitable advancement opportunities. Amy's insights forced us to examine assumptions we hadn't realized we were making about what constituted merit and how to identify potential in people who expressed it differently than we expected. But the real breakthrough came when Amy proposed that we conduct a comprehensive review of advancement patterns across all Maya Chen Enterprises companies, using her methodologies to identify where our merit-based systems might still be producing inequitable outcomes. Maya, she said during a portfolio review meeting 6 months after the TechFlow acquisition, I think we've discovered something important. Your approach of eliminating political advancement has significantly improved equity outcomes, but there are still gaps that we can address with more targeted interventions. What kind of gaps? Amy presented data showing that while all demographic groups had benefited from our organizational changes, women and people of color were still advancing at slightly lower rates than their performance metrics would predict. The good news is that the gaps are much smaller than in typical companies, and they're getting smaller over time as people adapt to merit-based systems. But we can accelerate that progress by being more intentional about identifying and developing talent that might not be immediately obvious. Such as structured programs for identifying high-potential employees who aren't naturally self-promotional, mentorship networks that specifically pair junior employees with senior leaders from different backgrounds, and advancement criteria that explicitly value collaborative skills alongside individual achievement. Marcus, who had joined us for the portfolio review, raised an interesting question. Amy, how do we balance actively promoting equity with maintaining genuinely merit-based advancement? I don't want us to create a system where people feel they're being promoted because of demographics rather than capability. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question that demonstrated how much Marcus had evolved in his understanding of these issues. Marcus, that's the beauty of Maya's approach, Amy replied. We're not lowering standards or creating separate tracks for different groups. We're identifying talented people who are being overlooked and ensuring they have equal opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities. But how do we avoid the perception that we're giving certain people advantages? By being transparent about our processes and focusing on outcomes, I said, jumping into the conversation. If we're successful, the people we promote through these enhanced opportunity programs will excel in their new roles, proving that they were advanced based on genuine potential rather than demographic characteristics. Amy nodded approvingly. Exactly. And Maya, the data from TechFlow supports this approach. The people we've promoted through our expanded talent identification programs are outperforming the people who were promoted under the old system. How so? Higher productivity, better team collaboration scores, more innovative project outcomes, and significantly higher retention rates among the people who report to them. It was compelling evidence that expanding our definition of merit and our methods for identifying talent was producing better business outcomes, not just better equity outcomes. Jessica, who had been taking notes throughout the discussion, looked up with a thoughtful expression. Amy, I'm curious about something. When you first approached Maya about these issues, were you expecting her to be resistant to addressing equity concerns beyond basic merit-based advancement? Honestly, yes. Most business leaders I've encountered are willing to eliminate obvious favoritism, but they get uncomfortable when you start talking about systemic barriers and unconscious bias. What convinced you that Maya was different? Amy smiled. 2 things. First, she asked substantive questions instead of getting defensive. But more importantly, she was genuinely curious about whether our methods could be improved, rather than just trying to justify why they were already sufficient. It was an observation that made me realize how much my own thinking had evolved through this process. I'd started with the goal of eliminating political dysfunction, and had gradually come to understand that creating truly equitable organizations required examining and addressing much more subtle forms of systemic bias. The portfolio review meeting concluded with plans to implement Amy's enhanced equity programs across all Maya Chen Enterprises companies, but it also marked the beginning of something larger. That evening, I received a call from Dr. Maria Santos, the Columbia Business School professor who had been tracking my acquisitions for her research on organizational transformation. Maya, she said, I've been following your work with Amy Rodriguez on equity-focused organizational change, and I think you might be interested in an opportunity that just came up. What kind of opportunity? The Harvard Business School has received a significant grant to establish a research center focused on developing and testing approaches to organizational equity. They're looking for a practitioner partner who has demonstrated success with large-scale cultural transformation. I felt a familiar mixture of excitement and intimidation. Dr. Santos, are you suggesting that I partner with Harvard on equity research? I'm suggesting that your portfolio of companies represents an unprecedented laboratory for testing interventions designed to eliminate systemic barriers to advancement. The research center would provide academic rigor and controlled study design, while your companies would provide real-world implementation and outcome measurement. What would that partnership look like? You would work with Harvard researchers to design and implement pilot programs across your companies, with rigorous data collection to determine what works and what doesn't. The goal would be to develop evidence-based approaches that other organizations could adopt. Dr. Santos, that sounds incredible, but also much larger in scope than anything I've attempted before. Maya, you've already demonstrated that market-based solutions can address problems that most people assume require government intervention. This partnership would help you scale that impact beyond your own portfolio and potentially influence how businesses approach equity issues across entire industries. After the call, I sat in my office looking out at the city lights, thinking about how far Maya Chen Enterprises had come from my original goal of proving that merit should determine advancement rather than politics. We had evolved into something that was testing whether business organizations could become genuinely equitable while remaining highly profitable. The Harvard partnership represented an opportunity to influence organizational change far beyond my own companies, but it also represented a level of responsibility that was both thrilling and daunting. My reflection was interrupted by a text from Amy. Maya, saw the news about your congressional testimony next month. Just wanted to say how excited I am that your approach to business transformation is getting national attention. The work we're doing proves that equity and excellence aren't competing priorities. They're complementary approaches to building organizations that actually work. I smiled, realizing that Amy had perfectly captured what I'd been struggling to articulate about the evolution of Maya Chen Enterprises. We weren't just running profitable companies, or even just creating equitable workplaces. We were proving that the business case for equity was actually an equity case for better business. As I prepared to leave the office, I thought about the congressional testimony I'd be giving in 2 weeks about market-based approaches to workplace equity. 3 years ago, I'd been a quiet analyst whose potential was dismissed by colleagues who confused loudness with leadership. Now I was being asked to testify before Congress about organizational transformation methods that had accidentally become a model for addressing some of the most persistent problems in corporate America. It was a responsibility I'd never sought, but one that felt like a natural extension of everything I'd been learning about the relationship between business success and human development. And with Amy's insights about equity, Jessica's understanding of political dynamics, Marcus's analytical capabilities, and James's perspective on leadership transformation, I felt ready to tackle challenges that were larger and more complex than anything I'd originally imagined. The portfolio of companies was growing, but more importantly, it was becoming a platform for proving that another way of organizing human effort was possible, one where excellence was genuinely rewarded, where potential was actively identified and developed regardless of demographics or background, and where business success was achieved through empowering people rather than exploiting them. As I walked through the lobby of the building that housed all 9 Maya Chen Enterprises companies, I realized that we weren't just running businesses anymore. We were conducting an ongoing experiment in human possibility, proving every day that work could be both economically productive and personally transformative. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test our methods against more complex problems, and new possibilities for demonstrating that sustainable success came from building rather than extracting, from developing rather than controlling, from empowering rather than diminishing the people who did the actual work. But tonight, I was content to walk home through the city where I'd once sat in a cubicle being dismissed by colleagues who couldn't see past their own limitations, knowing that we were building something that would outlast any individual career and create lasting change in how organizations approach the fundamental challenge of bringing out the best in human beings. The story was far from over, but every chapter was proving that another way was possible. The story was far from over, but every chapter was proving that another way was possible. 3 weeks later, I stood before the Senate Subcommittee on Economic Inequality, flanked by Amy Rodriguez and Jessica Torres as my expert witnesses. The hearing room was packed with business leaders, policymakers, and journalists who had come to hear about an approach to organizational change that was attracting attention across multiple sectors. Ms. Chen, Senator Warren began, your portfolio companies have achieved something remarkable, consistently above average profitability combined with measurably improved equity outcomes. Can you explain how these results challenge the conventional wisdom that businesses must choose between financial success and social responsibility? I looked out at the audience, which included several familiar faces. Marcus, who had flown in from a conference where he was presenting about collaborative leadership. James Crawford, whose book had been cited in the subcommittee's preliminary report, and even some former colleagues from the old Hartwell and Associates who had thrived under the new organizational culture. Senator Warren, I replied, I think the conventional wisdom is based on a false premise. It assumes that maximizing short-term profits requires treating employees as expendable resources rather than developing assets. Our experience demonstrates that companies perform better financially when they create environments where talent is genuinely recognized and developed. But surely there are costs associated with the comprehensive organizational changes you implement. Amy leaned forward to her microphone. Senator, if I may, the transformation costs are typically recouped within 6 months through improved retention, increased productivity, and better innovation outcomes. The real cost is maintaining dysfunctional systems that waste human potential. Senator Warren nodded approvingly. Ms. Rodriguez, you've documented significant improvements in advancement opportunities for women and people of color across the Maya Chen Enterprises portfolio. How do you respond to critics who argue that focusing on equity outcomes rather than pure merit could compromise business performance? Senator, that criticism misunderstands what we're actually doing, Amy replied. We're not lowering standards or creating separate advancement tracks. We're eliminating barriers that prevented talented people from demonstrating their capabilities in the first place. When you remove those barriers, you get better performance across all demographic groups. Jessica was asked to speak about the transformation of workplace culture and the elimination of political advancement systems. As I listened to her articulate insights about organizational dysfunction that she once embodied, I reflected on how far we'd all traveled from those early days at Hartwell. Ms. Torres, Senator Warren said, you previously worked in organizations that operated under the political advancement model that Ms. Chen's companies have eliminated. From your perspective, what are the broader implications of this transformation approach? Senator, the traditional model creates environments where people spend more energy on managing perceptions than on actually contributing value. When you eliminate that dynamic, you free up enormous amounts of human energy and creativity that can be directed toward productive work. Jessica paused, glancing briefly at me before continuing. But perhaps most importantly, organizations that truly reward merit rather than politics become places where people can grow beyond their current limitations. That's transformative not just for individual careers, but for society as a whole. The hearing concluded with Senator Warren announcing plans to introduce legislation that would provide tax incentives for companies that could demonstrate measurable progress toward equity-based advancement systems and transparent merit-based promotion criteria. That evening, there was a small celebration at a restaurant near Capitol Hill. The team that had testified, Amy, Jessica, Marcus, and I, was joined by James Crawford and several other people whose careers had been transformed through our organizational changes. Maya, Jessica said as we shared a toast, I keep thinking about something. 5 years ago, when I was bragging about that promotion I didn't deserve, did you already know you were going to change everything? I knew I was going to change my own situation, I replied. I didn't know it would become this. This being what, exactly? I looked around the table at people who had once been adversaries, colleagues, and mentors, all of whom had become partners in proving that another way of organizing human effort was possible. A movement, I suppose, a demonstration that business success and human development aren't competing priorities. Marcus raised his glass. To Maya, who proved that the people we overlook are often the ones we should be learning from. Amy added, and to proving that equity isn't just morally right, it's strategically smart. As we walked back to our hotel, Jessica fell into step beside me. Maya, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever miss the simplicity of when it was just about proving them wrong? When it was just about showing that you were more capable than they realized? I considered the question carefully. Sometimes, there was something satisfying about the clarity of that goal. But Jessica, what we've built is so much more important than personal vindication. How so? Because we've proven that the systems that overlooked me were also overlooking countless other people. Fixing those systems doesn't just validate my potential. It unleashes potential that was being wasted across entire organizations. And that's more satisfying than just being right? I smiled, thinking about the hundreds of employees across our portfolio companies who had advanced based on genuine merit, the innovations that had emerged when barriers to collaboration were removed, and the ripple effects as other organizations began adopting similar approaches. Jessica, being right was satisfying for about 5 minutes. Building something that actually works has been satisfying every day since. 6 months later, Maya Chen Enterprises announced its 15th acquisition. A struggling aerospace contractor whose talented engineers were leaving because advancement was based on government relations skills rather than technical competence. The transformation playbook that had evolved from those early days at Hartwell was now being studied by business schools and implemented by organizations across multiple industries. But the announcement I was most proud of came in the form of a different kind of expansion, the Maya Chen Institute for Organizational Excellence, a research and training center established in partnership with Harvard Business School to develop and disseminate evidence-based approaches to building genuinely equitable and high-performing organizations. The Institute's first cohort of students included Amy Rodriguez, who was pursuing her MBA while continuing to lead equity transformation initiatives across our portfolio, and Marcus Kim, who had enrolled in an executive education program focused on collaborative leadership. Standing in the Institute's main conference room, looking at the faces of people who had once dismissed my potential now learning to become the kind of leaders I'd always believed were possible, I felt a deep satisfaction that went far beyond personal vindication. Jessica approached me as the orientation session concluded, holding a folder with the Institute's curriculum, a program based on everything we'd learned about transforming dysfunctional organizations into places where talent actually mattered. Maya, she said quietly, do you remember that day at Hartwell when I told you that you weren't promotion material, that some people were just meant to be support staff? I smiled, thinking about how much had changed since then. I remember. I was so wrong. You weren't meant to be support staff. You were meant to build the kind of organization where support staff could become leaders, where quiet competence could flourish, and where people like me could learn to value substance over appearance. Looking around at the institute that bore my name but represented the collective wisdom of everyone who had participated in proving that another way was possible, I realized that Jessica was right. I hadn't been marriage material for their dysfunctional system. I had been transformation material for something infinitely better. And watching Marcus mentor a young analyst, Amy design equity programs that were being studied by universities worldwide, and Jessica teach other managers how to recognize actual talent over political skill, I knew that the real victory wasn't that I had succeeded despite being underestimated. The real victory was that we had built something where no one would have to be underestimated again. The end.